This is phoi thong. It's one of my wife's favorite desserts from Thailand. It's made from funneling egg yolk into these little strings with syrup. Now, when I found out about this process, I thought it was pretty cool, but specific. So I did a bit of research into the history of it, into how it came to be. And then I found out that it's not originally from Thailand, but Portugal.
From here came the sailors that made the maritime power that developed into modern Portugal.
Now, the weird thing is, Thailand was never a Portuguese colony. In fact, it was never a colony at all. So why is a Portuguese sweet one of Thailand's biggest snacks? This reminded me that my family is originally from Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, we have this sweet called dan tat, or egg tart. And dan tat is really similar to a Portuguese sweet called pastel de nata. This one makes a bit more sense because Hong Kong was right next to a Portuguese colony, Macau, and Portugal had been trading with Guangdong, the region that Hong Kong was a part of, for centuries before the British ever colonized it. But it's not only just these two places. Japan, the country that I'm currently living in now, also has a Portuguese-inspired sweet called Castella. But not only was Japan never a colony, they had blocked off trade from every Western nation for over 200 years. Well, they let the Dutch in, but that was it. So how is it that the Portuguese were the ones who influenced Japanese cuisine? I mean, even the Japanese word for bread, pan, is a loan word from Portuguese. This is kind of crazy to me because Portuguese cuisine isn't that famous. It's not like French or Italian cuisine, and it's really even hard to find a Portuguese restaurant. But despite this, Portuguese food seems to be hiding everywhere. And I mean everywhere, in literally almost every continent. So how is it that this small country's food made it to so many other cultures? And how is Portuguese cuisine actually one of the most influential in the world? Okay, let's move around the world today and briefly look at some dishes that have some influence from Portuguese cuisine, starting with where we left off, Japan. Beyond Castella, there's actually a few Japanese dishes that are inspired by the Portuguese, but I'm gonna single out the most famous one, tempura. Before Japan had closed itself from the West, Portugal actually had a pretty significant influence here. They were the first Europeans to actually reach Japan. So they were the ones who introduced them to guns, Christianity, and Western food. Okay, by the way, quick side note, Portugal had a slave trade with Japan where they traded Japanese, Korean, and Chinese slaves to bring back to Portugal. Like, what? How am I just finding out about this now? Eventually, it was the Christianity part, not the slavery, that freaked out Japan, and that's why they closed off the country. But not before the Portuguese influenced Japan to start cooking food with eggs and flour. Tempura became a popular street food in Japan, and the rest is history, because we need to move on to the next location, Malaysia. Now, Malaysia has a complicated colonial history. They were colonized and occupied by a lot of different countries, but the first Europeans to do so were the Portuguese. In the 15th century, Portugal colonized Malacca, a part of now modern-day Malaysia. During this time, a bunch of Portuguese started having families with the native Malaccans, and their children became a racially mixed group of people called the Kristang. The Kristang went on to develop a curry called gari debo. Debo meaning leftovers, and because it's spicy, the English translation of it became devil's curry. But the original name has nothing to do with the devil. In fact, it's actually a dish that's meant to be eaten right after Christmas, because the curry is meant to be made with leftovers from a Christmas meal. But speaking of curry, let's move on to India. A lot of people associate Indian colonization with the British, but Portugal had its own colony in India, and they actually held on to their colony longer than the British did. One of India's most popular curries, Vindaloo, comes from here, a state called Goa. What makes Vindaloo different from other Indian curries is that it uses the ingredient vinegar, something that wasn't really used by Indians at the time. The Portuguese had brought vinegar with them to marinate and preserve their meat for the long journey sailing towards India. And it was the marination of vinegar that gave their meat an enhanced flavor, which the Indians have been using ever since for Vindaloo curry. The preservation of meat was so important to Portugal because they were the first Europeans to really try and explore the globe, often having to sail around Africa, which is where we're going next.
What sorcery is this?
If you're a fan of chiquinandos from South Africa, you can thank the Portuguese for that as well. The sauce used for peri peri chicken in South Africa was first produced by the Portuguese, who were exploring the region at the time. It's said that the Portuguese mixed chili peppers native to the area with foreign ingredients like paprika, onion, and basil. They eventually left southern Africa, leaving the peri peri sauce they developed with the Africans, who soon started using it to marinate their chicken. But there's a bit of a dispute on where exactly this started. The two most likely answers are either modern-day Angola or Mozambique. Moving on, this next one's probably gonna piss off a few people. Nando's isn't the only popular food in the UK inspired by Portugal. In fact, one of Britain's largest institutions is based off of Portuguese cuisine: fish and chips.
Let's have some fish and chips. Let's be really elegant.
Okay, I'll be honest, Portugal isn't the only party involved here. Fried fish was brought to Britain by Jewish refugees in the form of the Portuguese and Spanish dish pescado frito, which looks very different to fish and chips today. Now, all this happened around the 16th century, and it's evolved to become part of Britain's identity. But Thomas Jefferson, the President of the United States, even once described the dish as fried fish in a Jewish fashion. At the same time, chips, or what Americans call fries, were being introduced by the French and the Belgians. But obviously most people eat fish and chips without ever knowing of its Portuguese roots. Alright, let's move on to the Americas, with Brazil. This is probably the most straightforward entry in the list. Brazil was Portugal's most high-profile colony, having been colonized for over 300 years, and being the country with the most Portuguese speakers in the world. Colonial Brazil was, of course, a terrible place with slavery, exhaustion of the land's resources, and all the other bad things that come with being a colony. But again, I just want to talk about the culinary footprint left by Portugal. And the best example of that is probably feijoada, a bean and meat stew. It's a national dish of Brazil using black beans, which alone is its own cultural symbol in the country, so it's a very Brazilian dish. But the story of its origins is contested. Some say the dish was developed by slaves in Brazil who made the stew because all the ingredients were cheap and easy to obtain. Others say that European settlers developed it with native ingredients from Brazil. Either way, the inspiration for the stew originally comes from a pork stew from ancient Rome and was brought to Brazil via Portugal. Finally, we're gonna move on to the last stop in this video. There's more dishes we could talk about, but for the sake of time and repetition, let's end it here, in the United States, which to me at least was the most surprising one. The Portuguese culinary footprint in the US begins in Hawaii.
This is Hawaii, 50th state of the Union.
Hawaiian sweetbread is actually Portuguese sweetbread. It's a pretty universal kind of bread you can find anywhere in America, especially diners, and was something that I always thought was the product of some chemical bread factory company. But it came from Portuguese immigrants who moved from the Azores, a chain of islands that Portugal owns, to Hawaii, which has a very similar climate. And I think this is a perfect example of how Portuguese food is literally hiding everywhere. This bread has blended into the American identity, much like what happened in all the other countries on this list. Because unlike the French bringing baguettes to Vietnam, or the Spanish bringing churros to Latin America, these foods' roots to Europe are kind of invisible. Portuguese food has somehow evolved to camouflage into very different culinary cultures. Hawaiian sweetbread is eaten everywhere, every day, and not a single time does anyone ever think it's not American. And I can say the same for tempura in Japan, fish and chips in the UK, and peri peri chicken in southern Africa. These dishes don't belong to Portugal anymore. They belong to the countries that eat them. And while Portuguese cuisine isn't one we often think about, you're likely eating it more than you've ever noticed. What I'm trying to say is that Portuguese cuisine is underrated. It should be up there with French, Italian, and Spanish, but it's often overlooked. And another detail that I wanted to add it but couldn't really find a place in the video to put it is that the Portuguese were the first Europeans to really try and explore the world. I mean, they were really the first Europeans to really establish sophisticated trade routes across Africa and Asia, so obviously they had first dibs to influence these places with their food. If you're from any country or place that I didn't mention, and your cuisine was also influenced by Portugal, then let me know down in the comments, because I would really love to just compile a list of literally every cuisine and every dish that has some connection or root to Portugal. But yeah, otherwise, if you liked the video, subscribe for more. I'm hoping to continue to keep making these videos. And I'm going to Thailand pretty soon, so hopefully I'll have some big video projects coming out from there. But yeah, otherwise, see you in the next video.